Hello and welcome to Mythic Mind, where we pursue wisdom on the paths between primary and secondary worlds. I'm your host Andrew Snyder, and I am always grateful for your company. For some good news, I'm recording quite a few interviews these days, and so we're going to have an episode each week of November instead of our normal every other week schedule. For this episode, I had a conversation with Aaron Bair, who was on the show a while back alongside David Rowe as we discussed Tolkien's short story, Farmer Giles of Ham. And so you can go back and listen to that if you're interested as well. Aaron is the author of A Joyful Outpost, exploring the household economy of the Beavers from the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And Aaron, by the way, is also a patron, and so he's clearly a man who has his life put together. His book is a great read, and it's a fairly quick read at that, and so I definitely think that you should pick it up. Well, now let's go ahead and jump into our conversation. I'd like to welcome Aaron Bair back to the show. It's been a little while. Last time we discussed Farmer Giles of Ham along with David Rowe, and so it's been a little while. Why don't you go ahead and just remind us a little bit about kind of who you are, and you can throw in there what brought you to Lewis as well.
Yeah, for sure. Well, first off, thanks for having me on. I got the invite back, which is always the test, right? So
right.
Grateful to have another chance to chat with you and talk about the Beaver book, I call it. But yeah, I am a school teacher in Utah. I've been teaching at the school I'm at. It's a middle school. This is my 5th year there. I teach language arts for 9th grade and 7th grade. And so my 9th graders, we actually just started reading George Orwell's Animal Farm for the year, which is actually kind of fun on the eve of an election. And then my 7th graders are about to start a Shakespeare play, which is always fun because we grab costumes from our drama teacher and dress up and just have a good time with that.
Wonderful. Yeah, I remember my days doing Julius Caesar in middle or high school and doing dress up, and it's a good time.
Oh yeah, it's always memorable for the students.
Yeah.
So and try to make Shakespeare fun.
Yeah.
A lot of kids at that age when they read Shakespeare, they're like, oh, I hate reading him. And so any avenue you can use to kind of make it a little bit lighter and a little more fun for them. It's definitely a worthy venture. Yeah, what else? I'm a father of 3. I have a 4th on the way as well, coming in this next spring. I've been married to my wife of 9 years. And I'm a deacon at my church, and I've been able to teach classes for people who are either newer to our church in particular, or to the Christian faith in general. And so I've been very thankful to serve in that capacity. That's probably enough about me. Turning to Lewis, though, I've been influenced by Lewis for a very long time. Growing up, I was very taken with the Narnia Chronicles, especially The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And then when I got older, being a young adult, I just got into his apologetics. So think of Mere Christianity, Screwtape Letters, but even some of his stuff on the Christian life too, like a Letters to Malcolm. That's excellent. I was really taken with those as a young adult. And as I started pursuing a career in teaching, I really got into his literary stuff. So An Experiment in Criticism, The Discarded Image, essays like On Stories. I was really taken with those, and he's really shaped my thinking on a lot of different things. You probably can agree to that.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Currently, I'm working on a piece in regards to the Fairy Queen. So I'm reading some of Lewis's stuff on that. So he has a couple of works. His big book on 16th century literature, and then another smaller one where it's like a series of lectures called Spencer's Images of Life. So I'm always essentially I always have a steady diet of Lewis in my life.
Yeah, I think that's quite healthy.
Yeah, it's like, of course you want to eat like all these greens and proteins and whatnot. I view Lewis in that same way.
Right. With as prolific as Lewis obviously was, both in his more academic work as well as popular works, and the fact that we recognize it's all good. Like, what do you think makes Lewis so compelling? Like, what makes him so good? As broad of a question as that is.
Yeah, that's a really tough question. I think you need to maybe start with well, first off, the broad appeal, right? Everyone loves him. I live in Utah, and I think it's the one state in the union that has never been predominantly Christian because of the LDS, Latter-day Saint, or Mormon Church. But Mormons love him. He,
Hmm,
they love Lewis. I went to a C.S. Lewis play on stage. I don't know if you've been to one of those before,
I
um,
haven't.
but it was really excellent. It was really fun. But I'll wager that the theater was packed, and I'll wager like 90 to 95% of the crowd was LDS and Mormon. Um, I think part of his appeal is he's able to just convey things in such a interesting way, and in a subversive way, kind of like a G.K. Chesterton, which there's an obvious influence there.
Sure.
But then also, maybe pulling in on stories and why his fiction in particular is so compelling. The Narnia Chronicles and the Ransom trilogy starting to make a comeback. You're probably on the front lines for why that's happening.
Doing what I
But
can.
yeah, but he's able to just create this atmosphere, this Donegality, you could say, that's is not rivaled by many other writers that have written recently. Of course, there's Tolkien, but you probably put the list on one hand of those kind of writers.
Right. Yeah, and regarding that, Donegal, the idea of his writing just sort of infused with a well influence, right? It's like a state of things. And he talks about that. I think it's in On Stories where he says that what really makes for a good story is not just the adrenaline rush of the plot progression, but it's the familiarity that actually calls you, further up and further into a state of being, and that it's that's what makes for good writing. I think it's true whether they're talking about story or it's nonfiction. It's like he doesn't just want to teach you things, although he does that. He wants to call you up to rest in the eternal good. It's all in Plato, right? So
Yeah,
Professor Kirk
yeah,
says, and
of course.
so he really lays it out right there, kind of what he's doing. And I think that whether we're talking his nonfiction or his fiction, he has distilled so much of pre-modern wisdom that then he kind of repackages for the everyday modern, which I think that that's really his strong hook, and to the point where people will read Lewis and say that he's so prophetic and anticipating kind of where culture was headed, and I mean he very much was. Read something like the Ransom series, right? Read That Hideous Strength. Read even the cultural critiques of Narnia. The Experiment House and all that stuff that he definitely
Yeah,
was anticipating where things were going. But really, I think that what makes him so powerful is just the fact that he had a pre-modern perspective. He understood things like what does it mean to be man, to be a human, which is a question that doesn't really make sense in the postmodern world. And so he had a different array of wisdom that he was able to bring forward that so many of us are simply bereft of in this world that's constantly given over to postmodern relativism and scientism and all these things that he just does such a good job of dismantling, not even in like an aggressive way but in a very winsome, charming kind of way. And I think that's one of the things that makes him so compelling. But bringing it more specifically to why we're here. Tell us a little bit about your book. I mean, what's the basic premise and what led you in this direction?
yeah, and I actually want to echo some of the stuff that you just said, because that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book to begin with. Because over the past few years, I've just been really convicted about trying to recapture a biblical ontology of man, or maybe to put it another way, what are we called to, and how does that really work with our original design? And so, we find ourselves in a world, the postmodern relativistic world that is disenchanted with the good, true, and beautiful, right? And we're openly aligning ourselves with dark enchantment, or the dark enchantment of the witch's winter. We're openly aligning ourselves with that. And so, turning to the book, one of the reasons why I wrote it is not to unearth some secret layer to Lewis's writings, kind of like a Planet Narnia. It's more of like trying to just call attention to some of the obvious pre-modern truths that Lewis held, that Christians of old held, regarding masculinity, femininity. What does it mean to be an image bearer? And it's through the lens of the Beavers.
So the Beavers are, I mean, in the big scope of Narnia, I guess they're relatively minor, even though they play a significant role in this book. Um, why do you think they merit this kind of attention? Like, what do they bring to the story?
Yeah. There are a few reasons. First off, they are pretty unique to the narrative. Of course, there are a bunch of talking animals in Narnia, um, but not every animal can sew and cook and smoke a pipe. So they're unique in that regard. They belong more to like Kenneth Graham's The Wind and the Willows more than they do to Narnia in that sense. They're more humanistic than other animals. I would say like only Reepicheep, maybe Truffle Hunter, come close to rivaling the beavers in being more human than animal. And so in that regard, they're just really unique. But also what they represent to the overall narrative. And we already kind of talked about the pre-modern worldview. And in the opening chapter, I argue that that the beavers kind of they're symbols, they're representations of the old world. They are an image of a world that has been discarded by our modern world. And I pull in That Hideous Strength, a passage there, to kind of bolster that argument. And then lastly, they're one of the only married couples in Narnia. And, seeing their dynamic gives us a picture. And honestly, for our culture, it's a very countercultural picture of how husbands and wives are to interact with each other. But for Lewis, it's just a kind of well, yeah, of course, this is how a man and woman, a husband and wife should interact with each other.
Now, um, I guess let me just ask this basic question. What is the Christian home? Like, what does that even mean, and how does that differentiated from, the broader cultural idea of the home that we're currently dealing with?
Yeah, for sure. Couple points there. I think maybe to answer the first question, ultimately, I think a Christian home is or should be a joyful outpost. Just to maybe pull in the title of the book. I think one of the most profound images from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is when the Pevensies are sitting down to dinner with the Beavers. And Pauline Baynes did a wonderful picture of it, of course. And so they're sitting to dinner, and in that picture, you see so many things, right? You see them feasting, they're enjoying each other's company, communing with each other. There's hospitality taking place. Mr. Beaver is telling them the prophecies of spring, telling them about Aslan, right? So there's the prophetic image there. And so they're just having a great time, and it's just it's a deeply charming picture. I mean, we haven't really talked about your background that much, but I mean, look at that background. That is so good. And while that's happening, outside the Beaver's Dam, it's the Witch's Winter, right? It's an enchanted winter. It's a winter that's waging war on the Narnians. That's ultimately death and despair, thorns and thistles from Genesis 3. It's no good, and yet here's this joyful outpost where they are doing what they're called to do. And so I think first and foremost, that's what a Christian home should be. It's doing those types of things, doing the Christian life, regardless of what is going on in the culture around them. And to the second question, the home, I think, has just been severely devalued, deconstructed, you could even say, too. Like, how would we define the household in the modern day? It feels more like a pit stop than anything else, where mom and dad both working jobs, kids are off at public school, and they're just, maybe they stop for a quick meal, right? And then they just head out to do their own thing again. And the home has just lost its ultimate value and its calling. And I think that's to our detriment as a society.
Yeah, and in the way that you were describing the warmth of the home in contrast to the dead of winter that's surrounding the beavers, it brings to mind some of the like Germanic imagery of the mead hall in the winter. This idea of the long defeat, to use Tolkien's language, which is not terribly different from what Lewis gives us, which obviously they're both enamored by the Northern spirit. But it's this idea that you've got the encroaching monsters around you. You've got the encroaching death of winter, and you very well may expect that in the end the winter's going to win out. But as long as there is warmth and fellowship to be had in the halls, you have an obligation to defend those halls, right? To keep them full of merriment, to fan those flames of human good for as long as you possibly can. Um, so I definitely see some of that imagery here as well. And the
On
fact that
that
it's
point,
not just, yeah, go ahead, no, please.
oh no, I was just going to jump in and say, to that exact point, uh, Mr. Badger's house in The Wind in the Willows, which I think is a pretty clear inspiration for the Beavers home to a degree, for Lewis. He uses that. Graham uses that exact same language of like it's a place. Badger's home is a place for I'm paraphrasing a bit, but warriors to sit down and just kind of enjoy each other and revel from and rest from battle. That kind of same language. Sorry, you can keep going.
Yeah. So I mean, there it is. And I'm not really familiar with Wind in the Willows, even though I know I should be. But yeah, so that's good to know that I'm on the right track with that. Um, yeah, I think that is important. The difference between a home and merely a residence, or like a house, the pit stop, as you said. Um, so like, how do we go about establishing a beaver-like home? I mean, even Christians largely have this very pragmatic viewpoint of the house very often. And so how do we go about intentionally cultivating this kind of home that you're endorsing for us?
Yeah, I mean, it starts small. It starts as small as sitting down to dinner, something of that nature. Is ultimately, I think you need to maybe understand um, allegiances, right? We are servants of the King, and we want to image him as best as we can. In Joyful Outpost, I spend a good deal of time talking about the image of God and how ultimately we are to image him in all things, but from being hospitable to men acting like men, women acting like women, um, all those different things. So I think it probably starts there. Like, where does our allegiance lie, and like submitting ourselves to that ultimately to the Lord, obviously. But yeah.
Now, when you bring up things like, okay, men acting like men, women acting like women, I mean, naturally, it's going to bring up, knee-jerk reactions of sexism, and so you think that men should boss women around, or like, so. I mean, how do you defend it against those obvious assaults that are going to come from our culture?
Yeah, I knew writing this it was going to be controversial, um, but this is a side of Lewis that we don't really hear much about. Either maybe it's from people they don't know this side of Lewis, or maybe they know it and they just don't agree with it, and that's probably a bit of both. And just in the culture that we live, as you say, in our highly egalitarian culture, this is offensive to many ears. But I think it's really important. And so, I use essays like membership and democratic education and prejudices in the church, where Lewis is articulating his thoughts on that exact point. And then I'm using those essays to help shed light on what's going on in the narrative, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, specifically with the Beavers, and why their dynamic is the way that it is. And so in those essays, first off, Lewis he talks about equality, obviously, and he does mention there is an equality that's necessary in our culture, where if we didn't have this type of equality, then the strong and the rich would prey on the poor and the weak. And I'm sure we could all cite examples from history of where that's actually happened. And so those kinds of guardrails are important, but it's that kind of equality is only necessary in a fallen world, but it doesn't really get to what we're originally designed for, coming back to ontology. And so Lewis kind of talks about in membership about like kind of stripping off that disguise and being able to be who you truly are, who you're truly made to be. And yeah, I totally affirm, traditional male and female roles in the book. I think that's pretty clear from Narnia that he kind of thought the same way. And so, like some examples, the first one that I cite is, it's no coincidence that it's Mr. Beaver who's out there in the woods trying to save the Pevensies and bring them into his home rather than Mrs. Beaver. It might sound kind of like, well, why are you raising this question to begin with? It seems kind of out of place. But I don't think it's out of place at all. I think it's a pretty relevant question and something that we need to wrestle with as a culture. Also, maybe the charges of sexism. One of the arguments that I make in the book is, when we try to diminish, or when we try to blend the roles together, what men can do, what women can do, or like what we're called to. When we blend them together, we're diminishing the high calling that the Lord has bestowed on both men and women. And so it's totally okay that, it's Mr. Beaver who goes and fights in the Battle of Baruna at the end of the narrative. While after the battle, Mrs. Beaver is one of those who tends and nurtures the wounded after. Neither task is inferior to the other, I would say. But, we are ultimately an unsettled people, a discontented people, a covetous people, honestly. And, we desire the glories of others while turning a blind eye to the glories placed right in front of us. And one of the things that I see from the Beavers ultimately is that they are content in who they're called to be, and they execute it. And they play a very key role in the coming of the Golden Age of Narnia.
The Mythic Mind Fellowship presents a new study led by Dr. Andrew Snyder, The Wisdom of Middle-earth, The Lord of the Rings. This will be the first study in the Wisdom of Middle-earth series, which seeks to bring an array of companions together with a common desire of growing in wisdom while enjoying the heartening tales of the great tale weaver, J.R.R. Tolkien. The Lord of the Rings is a profound tale that has literally changed lives, as it has for mine. And what is it that makes this story so powerful and so compelling? It is because Tolkien's stories are fundamentally true, and those who engage with it know exactly what I mean. They speak to the way that things are. As Peter Kreeft said in The Philosophy of Tolkien, the Lord of the Rings is infused with the same light that illumined the man who wrote it, and that light is true, for it reveals the reality of the world and life. So join us on this adventure. Let us grow in wisdom together through immersion in this tale, not through cheap allegorizing, but by getting a better understanding of the ideas and the movements of the heart that bring a tale such as this to life. This 12-week study will begin with Tolkien's creation account, the Ainulindale, and then move to the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring. Each week will include assigned reading from the Lord of the Rings, a short side lesson at the beginning of the week that addresses a relevant theme, background story, or secondary text. And then, once you've had some time to do the reading, there will be a longer video that serves as a guide in these forests of wisdom. Also, we will have additional recommended readings, an active Discord channel, and weekly live meetings, which will be recorded in case you cannot attend. Whether you are reading The Lord of the Rings for the first time, or the 11th time, I invite you to join our company. Prices are currently as low as they ever have been, and they are as low as they ever will be, so go ahead and join today at andrewsnyder.podia.com. And I hope to see you on this road that goes ever on. Yeah, and that is something that you can't avoid that in Lewis, even if you tried, and I don't think you should try. But even in mere Christianity, right? He spends a while talking about the difference between the masculine and feminine calling, the callings of males and females. And so this is pretty important for Lewis. Obviously, we see it in Narnia. Obviously, we see it in the Ransom series. I mean, the fact that the whole Ransom series is really this dialectic between Mars and Venus, the masculine and the feminine. And
Yeah,
we see that the way that is misrelated at the beginning of That Hideous Strength, but in the way it all kind of comes together as part of the great dance of the cosmos. And for Lewis, he's very consistent with this, that the way that you really become yourself is by playing your role in the great dance. And what that means is we have to recognize that different things are different things. Different things have different parts to play within that dance. And, that goes all the way up to the outermost edges of the cosmos, moving in imitation or in reflection of the glory of God, all the way down to the male and female in the home. And I know that's kind of where you end the book, discussing that cosmic harmony idea. And so we'll come back to that. But yeah, the point is, I entirely agree. This is fundamental to Lewis, and I think it's fundamental to becoming ourselves, to figure out kind of who you are in this existence that transcends yourself. Um, in addition to those various essays that you mentioned, also in Screw Tape Proposes a Toast, he addresses this idea of like democracy run wild a lot,
right.
where we take the idea, or Screw Tape and his people are gonna take the idea of democracy and try to stretch it out to apply to everything, to the point where we just flatten everything out until it's nothing. And that's it's demonic. It's a way to become nothing. And well, God's in the business of making something. And so that idea of distinction really is quite important. I think that you handle that really well. Um, Now, you talk about hospitality a good bit, which is obviously, I mean, an important part of a home. Now, I'm an introvert. Does this mean I need to have people over every day, or like, what is hospitality? What's that look like?
Every day, man. I'm just kidding.
Oh,
Um, no, but I do think it's ultimately an important part of the Christian life. We aren't meant to do it by ourselves, obviously, right? We need a community around us, supporting us, encouraging us, keeping us accountable, of course. And it does go back to the image of God. We are, as image bearers, recipients of the great host's hospitality, right? We're welcomed into this world. And so, as image bearers, we should regularly get together with fellow believers for that reason, to encourage and equip each other. And coming to the story, maybe to Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you could argue, that without hospitality, the whole story doesn't really happen, right? There are multiple instances I could cite, but for the Beavers, if Mr. Beaver didn't welcome the Pevensies into his home, then who knows what would have happened. They would still have been stranded in the woods. But you could also go farther back and talk about Mr. Thomas and him welcoming Lucy into his home, to the great professor welcoming the Pevensey children into his home. I mean, it's all over the place, right? And so it's really important to be hospitable and to take joy in it as well. I think it's easy to think of it as just another task to be weighed down with. And honestly, I know I've been guilty of that for sure at times. But it's with the Beavers, the first thing that happens when they get into their home, Mrs. Beaver, she's sewing a line, and then she sees them, and immediately she gets up and welcomes them into the home and whisks the girls off to make dinner while Mr. Beaver takes the boys out to find the fish or catch the fish. And so it's just kind of, it's very clear for them, it's just a muscle that's just like, it's just natural. It's completely natural to them. And getting to that point for us, I'm definitely not there yet, but I strive to be.
yeah. And so, as you mentioned, there are all these examples of where hospitality plays an important role. And of course, on the inversion of that, you also get the faux hospitality of the witch to Edmund. And so you get a counterexample of that as well. That, both, Peter and gang, they're getting drawn in through hospitality, ultimately closer to Aslan, right? This is the first time they really hear about Aslan is in the home of the Beavers, as they're being drawn into this realm of warmth and love and ultimately life that is befitting of such an introduction, as well as, Edmund is being invited into the seduction essentially of the witch, and she's being, it's kind of like Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly here, are both offering these invitations to feast but with very different ends. And so I think that is an interesting contrast. Um, Now, once they leave the Beavers, they encounter Father Christmas. Um, how do you defend Santa Claus against the objections of Lewis just throwing stuff in there at this point?
Oh yeah. Honestly, man, when you send me these questions, I'm like, this is the hardest question that you've sent me. I don't know what to do with this one. um, Thankfully, there has been some literary criticism from since the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was published. I'm thinking of like one of the better ones for sure on this point is Planet Narnia. And so, Michael Ward talks about Father Christmas being a son of Jupiter, and how just that jovial atmosphere from the Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. Um, it makes sense in that respect to have Father Christmas in there, because he's there bestowing gifts, and it gives like kind of a personalized nature as well to the gift giving, because ultimately the Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe is about the death of winter and the coming of spring, right? The witch's winter being put to death, the spell is broken, and spring comes in. The doors that were once veiled have now been unveiled, right? That eschatological language right there. And so that in of itself is the ultimate gift. But having, a figure give gifts to children also just kind of plays a cool, it gives a cool picture to the whole jovial uh, atmosphere of Jupiter.
Yeah, and first of all, my first reaction when people go at him for this is Lewis is writing a fairy tale, first of all. It's not necessarily like high fantasy. And I think that allows for some more freedom of it's fun, but even more profound than that. I think that you're right. I think that um, I mean, what better symbol is there in the modern mythos, at least, of joviality than Father Christmas?
Yeah.
And in the story, I mean, he shows up and he symbolizes the fact that time is now moving and that we're actually now headed toward Christmas and ultimately toward spring. And so Father Christmas shows up, and principally what he's doing is he's acting as a herald of Aslan. He says that the king is coming, Aslan is coming, and so he is the forerunner to Aslan, who is himself the jovial spirit in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He is the joy that comes after a hard won victory through the winter. That's what the influence of Joe fundamentally is. And so I think that mythologically it works. In also, I just think it works as fairy tale.
Yeah. I love that he's also, Lewis put him in his proper place too, as a servant of Aslan, right?
Right.
Compared to, the deification of Santa Claus in this day and age. Yeah, I'm one of those people that, I've heard criticisms of like, well, what the heck? Why is King Arthur and Merlin in that hideous strength? I'm like, it's
Because it's
awesome,
awesome.
guys.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, the Ransom series is, I mean, if you try to just summarize the plot to somebody who is not familiar, it sounds insane, but it's
It
so
does. It
good and
does.
so compelling when you actually read it. I mean, the fact that, okay, you've got this philologist who goes to Venus to punch out the devil, and then he has to come back to meet Merlin and become the Pendragon. It's like it's crazy. It's so good. Um,
Random. Do you ever think we'll
yeah.
see the Ransom trilogy on the screen?
Oh, I have my hopes. I have my hopes. The tricky one would be how do you film Paralandra?
Yeah, that's
I
true.
guess really convenient camera angles, but,
Probably.
I certainly hope so. I certainly hope so. I mean, that is I'm so glad to see resurgence or a there seems to be a popular emphasis on the Ransom series. People seem to be discovering it for the first time. I mean, I just discovered it the first time like a couple years ago, and it basically became my personality for a while. And I just, the more that I tweeted about it, more I talked about it, the more people seem to be jumping into it, and there's definitely excitement there because it's just, I think, such an important story. I mean, simply a good story on a storytelling angle, but it's such an important story philosophically as a way to re-enchant the modern age. Yeah, but I could go off on Ransom for a while.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely, that book and The Abolition of Man, those are the two that, everyone's talking about nowadays because there's so many parallels that we can
Oh
draw,
yeah,
right? But I think That Hideous Strength goes farther, and I think Lewis probably agrees just because it is story and it is able to circumvent those maybe those watchful dragons and other things that kind of um, bar our way from really appreciating a point or a philosophy.
yeah, and a couple years ago or whenever it was, there's that article coming out saying that Lord of the Rings is going to radicalize you to the far right or something. But Lord of the Rings does nothing to that effect, like the Ransom series does. When, at the end of Out of the Silent Planet, Lewis basically comes out and says, in his epilogue, by the way, this is real. Go cast down the demonic scientists. It's like he basically just lays it out there, like I'm writing about what's really happening here. And so definitely some radicalizing potential there. Um, and I don't know. I mean, we need something to wake us up from the just stupor of modern life. You need something kind of radical to help you recognize what he's doing. Um, what's your favorite Lewis book?
Ooh. Um, Silverchair.
Okay, that's a good contender. I would say Silverchair is my favorite Narnia book. Favorite book overall, I have to give it to Till We Have Faces.
Fair enough. That's really good.
Yeah.
That's really good. It's been a couple of years though since I've read it, so I want to. It's probably your fault seeing all your tweets about it. I need to return to it again.
Yeah, that's the kind of book you can keep returning to and discover new things because I mean, it's the last novel he got out and it's the one that is most profoundly a myth to the point where, Ransom series, you can read it and as long as you have some knowledge of what he's doing, it's easy to figure out what he's communicating on the ideological level. Whereas Till We Have Faces, it's the kind of thing you just have to enter into and then you walk out of it with something. And there's still these fundamental questions regarding exactly what's happening, especially in toward the end of the book too. And that's something I really appreciate. It's a little bit more solid. It's not quite as transparent. Well, is there anything else that you wanted to mention or anything else you wanted to talk about?
Well, we could talk about the ending, the
Yeah.
harmony of the cosmos. You want to do that?
Yeah, yeah, please.
Yeah. So maybe to wrap the conversation in a bow, um, at the end of the book, I I talk about music in Narnia and how it plays such a big role in the series as a whole. Obviously in the Magician's Nephew, which is the sixth book of the Chronicles, right, Andrew? That's right.
That's right.
Definitely not the first. Harper Collins. Jeez. Um, but yeah, the in the Magician's Nephew, Aslan sings Narnia into creation, as Diggory and Uncle Andrew and Polly and Queen Jadis sees it uh, come into creation. But as Aslan is creating Narnia, there's this beautiful passage about how the stars are singing back to Aslan. And it's just this beautiful picture of harmony that creation itself has a voice. Um,
That's right.
but
Even in your
just
world, it's what a star is. It's not what or it's what a star's made of. It's not what it is, right?
absolutely, yeah. I just read that to my daughter the other night. We're almost done with the Dawn Treader. Um, but just like Melkor's counter melody in the Silmarillion, right? There's a disharmony that exists in Narnia, and it's really potent. Obviously, the Witch's Winter is very, very potent. The Telmarine's Disenchanted Narnia is very, very powerful in a sense, and we're all prey to that kind of thought, that kind of living. A big example I use in the chapter is when Mr. Tumnus welcomes Lucy into his home, and as they're eating, he then he uses music to then enchant her into sleep, and it was an act of disharmony with the lion. And thankfully, Tumnus recognizes that and repents of that sin. And I think that's a good thing for us to ponder. Where are we? Are we in harmony with the lion, or are we in disharmony? Are we giving too much attention to the dark enchantment of winter, and not enough attention to the joyous spring that's coming, right? And so ultimately, for my book, it's a prayer for people to start thinking about those little things that they can do to fortify their home for the growth of that kingdom, and to harmonize with the lion.
Yeah, it's good. And I think that's a powerful connection between, the very fibers of the cosmos, right? The song that brings the cosmos into existence, as well as the harmony we have that we bring about in our own home, and even just with ourselves, connected to the broader scene. I guess I gotta be careful when I talk about harmony with ourselves. That sounds kind of postmodern. But the inner harmony as a microcosm of the world that actually is above and beyond ourselves. And that it's when we recognize that hierarchy that's intrinsic in existence itself that we actually find the pathway to meaning. And if we're going to take the hyper democratic route and destroy all hierarchy as such, we're actually destroying our very pathway to happiness, to joy, to meaning. We're forsaking the calling of Tor and Paralandra to content ourselves in our littleness and to just receive and to be glad. But when we're constantly trying to create rather than simply receive, well, we're kind of lost in a Nietzschean abyss of no clear direction to go. And so, I'm really just echoing what you said, that there's just so much freedom in finding your place rather than trying to create it out of nothing. And I think that's what it means to bear the image of God. We're called to reflect, not fundamentally to create. So good. Anything else that you wanted to say?
I don't think so.
All right. Well, good. And so I definitely appreciate you coming back. Everyone go out and buy his book, Joyful Outpost. And we'll have to do this again sometime and maybe talk some other Lewis or something else. So thanks again for popping in.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. I hope that you enjoyed that conversation, and again, remember to pick up a Joyful Outpost, and if you're listening to this through the podcast, then you can find a link in the show notes. And of course, that is my book recommendation for you this time. Also, if you want for me to be able to keep producing content like this and to keep having conversations like this on a regular basis, ideally, I would love to get to a place where I can do a fresh, full episode every week for you. But if you want for that to happen, then please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/mythicmind, which also gives you access to more and ad-free Mythic Mind content, as well as access to our Discord channel and an invitation to participate in patron chats on the Mythic Mind Fellowship podcast. Oh, and whether you become a patron or not, be sure to check out the Mythic Mind Fellowship podcast and subscribe to that one as well. Over there, we're currently working our way through the Norse Poetic Edda, which is just really it's a lot of fun. Whether you read the Edda yourself or you just listen to our conversation, I have a lot of fun with it, and I think that you probably will as well. And so you can listen to that whether you become a patron or not. But that's it for now, and until next time, Godspeed.